Most people believe manipulation looks obvious: lies, threats, intimidation. But the most powerful manipulation never looks like control. It looks like kindness. It sounds like concern. It feels like friendship. Every day, people influence your decisions, shape your emotions, and quietly guide your behavior without you realizing it. They do it through subtle language, emotional pressure, social expectations, and psychological triggers your brain is wired to obey. This audiobook will expose the hidden mechanics behind manipulation, the tactics people use to steer your thinking, the signals manipulators rely on, and most importantly, how to recognize and neutralize them before they take control of your choices. Because the moment you can see manipulation clearly, it stops working. Chapter 1. Manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious. They imagine lies, threats, aggression, someone forcing you, someone shouting, someone trying to dominate the room. But that is not how manipulation usually works. Real manipulation is quiet. It is polite. It is friendly. It is helpful. And that is exactly why it works. Manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. It looks like advice. It looks like concern. It looks like someone saying, "I just want what's best for you." That's the key. Because the most effective control never announces itself as control. It disguises itself as care. Imagine a simple situation. You tell someone about a decision you want to make. Maybe you want to start a business. Maybe you want to move somewhere new. Maybe you want to leave a job that drains your energy. And the response comes quickly. "I'm just worried about you." That sounds risky. I think you should think about this more. On the surface, these statements sound supportive. They sound reasonable. But listen carefully. The message hidden underneath is not curiosity. It is direction. It is subtle pressure pushing your decision in a different direction. Not through force, through influence. And influence is where manipulation lies. Because manipulation does not attack your freedom directly. It quietly reshapes your thinking. Your brain is designed to cooperate with other people. Human beings evolved to survive in groups, which means your mind is constantly scanning for social signals: approval, disapproval, acceptance, rejection. Your brain wants harmony. It wants approval more than conflict. That is why subtle pressure works so well. When someone shifts their tone, when they look disappointed, when they frame your decision as irresponsible, your brain immediately starts adjusting. Not because you're weak, because you're human. And manipulators understand this. They rely on it. They don't force. They suggest. They imply. They nudge. And slowly, your decision begins to change. Think about how advice is often delivered. You should really consider something more stable. People usually regret decisions like that. "I just think you're making a mistake." None of these statements sound aggressive. But they are not neutral either. They are directional. They are designed to guide your thinking toward a specific outcome. And because they sound calm and reasonable, you rarely question them. You assume they must be right. That's the trap. Manipulation hides inside normal conversation. Here is the pattern you must learn to recognize. Manipulation rarely demands. It suggests. Manipulation rarely forces. It pressures. Manipulation rarely attacks. It frames. And the pressure is almost always subtle. A pause. A sigh. A disappointed tone. A comment disguised as concern. These signals create a psychological weight. A quiet tension in the conversation. And suddenly you feel something inside you. The need to explain yourself. The need to justify your choice. The need to soften your decision. That feeling is not random. That feeling is pressure. And if it feels subtly pressuring, it probably is. Remember that. If it feels subtly pressuring, it probably is. Let's look at another example. Someone asks you for a favor. Maybe they want your time. Maybe they want help with something that drains your energy. You hesitate. And then they say something like this: "I guess I'll just figure it out myself." Oh, it's fine. I know you're busy. Oh, I thought you'd understand. Notice what just happened. They never demanded anything. They never directly pushed. But the emotional pressure immediately increased. Now you feel guilty. Now you feel responsible. Now you feel like saying no would make you a bad person. That is manipulation. It is emotional leverage. And it works because it doesn't look aggressive. It looks like disappointment. Most manipulation succeeds for one reason. People are trained to be polite. You are trained to cooperate. You are trained to avoid conflict. From childhood, you are taught to be agreeable, be helpful, be respectful. But manipulators know something most people never realize. Politeness can be exploited. Your willingness to keep the peace can be used against you. Your desire to avoid tension can become a doorway for control. And the manipulator never needs to raise their voice. All they need to do is apply pressure quietly. This is why awareness changes everything. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing the tone shifts, the guilt signals, the subtle expectations hiding inside normal conversations. You start asking a new question. Is this advice or influence? Is this concern or pressure? Is this support or control? And that moment of questioning creates space. Space between stimulus and response. Space where you regain control of your decisions. You have a choice. That's the key. Manipulation works when you react automatically. It fails when you pause and observe. From now on, listen differently. Pay attention to the emotional temperature of conversations. Notice when someone frames your decision as irresponsible. Notice when advice carries an invisible expectation. Notice when someone's tone subtly pressures you toward compliance. And remember the rule. If it feels subtly pressuring, it probably is. Not always, but often enough that you must examine it carefully. Because the moment you begin recognizing manipulation, you begin reclaiming your autonomy. Your decisions become yours again. Not shaped by guilt. Not shaped by pressure. Not shaped by someone else's hidden agenda. But awareness alone is only the beginning. Because to fully understand manipulation, you must understand something deeper. You must understand the system inside your own brain that makes influence possible. The triggers, the instincts, the psychological shortcuts manipulators rely on every single day. You now see the disguise. Now it's time to understand the mechanism. Chapter 2. The human brain is built to be influenced. Manipulation does not begin with the manipulator. It begins with the brain. Your brain. Because the truth is uncomfortable but simple. The human brain is built to be influenced. Not occasionally. Constantly. Every day your mind absorbs signals from the people around you. Tone of voice. Facial expressions. Social reactions. Approval. Disapproval. Acceptance. Rejection. Your brain reads these signals automatically. You don't decide to analyze them. Your brain does it instantly. And that system evolved for one reason: survival. For most of human history, being accepted by the group meant safety. Being rejected meant danger. Isolation could mean death. So your brain developed powerful mechanisms designed to keep you aligned with the group. You learned to read approval. You learned to avoid disapproval. You learned to adjust your behavior to maintain social harmony. That system kept humans alive for thousands of years. But today, it creates a vulnerability. Because the same psychological wiring that once protected you can now be exploited. Manipulators understand this. And they rely on it. Your brain responds to signals faster than logic. That's the key. Before you think, you feel. Before you analyze, you react. And manipulators operate inside that reaction. They trigger emotion first. Because once emotion is activated, your decision-making becomes easier to influence. Fear, guilt, obligation, approval. These emotions move faster than reasoning. And when emotion leads, logic often follows behind, trying to justify the decision that was already made. That's why influence feels natural. Because it happens before you realize it's happening. One of the most powerful triggers in human psychology is authority. When someone appears confident, knowledgeable, or experienced, your brain automatically lowers its defenses. You assume credibility. You assume expertise. You assume they know something you don't. This is why people follow leaders. Why they trust experts. Why they obey confident voices. But this instinct can be manipulated. Someone who speaks with certainty can influence people even when they are wrong. Someone who sounds confident can guide decisions even without evidence. Confidence creates authority. Authority creates influence. And influence shapes behavior. You must understand this pattern. Because your brain is trained to follow signals of authority automatically. But automatic obedience is where manipulation begins. You have a choice. You can pause. You can question. You can examine the influence instead of accepting it instantly. That pause protects your independence. Another powerful psychological trigger is reciprocity. Humans feel a deep instinct to repay kindness. If someone gives you something, your brain feels pressure to return the favor. This instinct maintains fairness in social groups. But manipulators use it strategically. They offer small favors, small gifts, small acts of kindness, not out of generosity, but to create obligation. Once you feel indebted, your resistance lowers. You feel uncomfortable saying no, even if the request is unreasonable, because your brain whispers something powerful. You owe them. But obligation is not always fairness. Sometimes it is leverage. And recognizing that difference is critical. You don't need their permission. You don't need to repay every favor with obedience. Kindness should never become a chain. Another trigger manipulators rely on is the fear of rejection. Human beings hate social exclusion. It activates the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. Rejection hurts deeply. And because rejection hurts, people will often change their behavior to avoid it. They soften opinions. They adjust decisions. They say yes when they want to say no. They comply to maintain acceptance. Manipulators understand this instinct. They may not threaten rejection directly. Instead, they hint at it. A disappointed look. A cold tone. A comment like, "I thought you were different." Oh, "I guess I was wrong about you." These statements activate the fear of losing approval. And suddenly the pressure feels heavy. Not logical. Emotional. That's how influence works. And again, your brain reacts before you fully analyze what just happened. Because your brain wants approval more than truth. Remember that. Your brain wants approval more than truth. Guilt is another powerful psychological trigger. Guilt pushes people to repair relationships. It encourages responsibility. But manipulators transform guilt into control. They use phrases designed to activate emotional obligation. "After everything I've done for you. I thought you cared. I guess I just expected more." These statements are not discussions. They are pressure. They bypass logic and go straight to emotion. And once guilt appears, your brain shifts its focus. You stop asking what is fair. You start asking how to fix the feeling. That is exactly what manipulators want. Because guilt redirects your attention away from the truth and toward emotional repair, which makes compliance easier. But remember the principle. Guilt is not always truth. Sometimes it is simply influence wearing the mask of morality. And finally, there is the deepest human instinct of all. The desire to belong. People want to feel accepted. They want to feel understood. They want to feel part of something. This instinct drives friendships, communities, families. But it also creates vulnerability, because the desire to belong can override independent thinking. If the group believes something, individuals often follow. If the group disapproves, individuals often adjust. Manipulators understand group psychology very well. They frame ideas as socially accepted. They imply that everyone agrees. They make resistance feel like isolation. And again, the brain reacts quickly, because belonging feels safe. Disagreement feels risky. That's the hidden influence shaping countless decisions every day. And once again, the rule applies. Your brain wants approval more than truth. But awareness changes the game. Once you understand these triggers, they lose much of their power. When someone uses authority, you examine the evidence. When someone offers favors, you recognize the potential obligation. When someone applies guilt, you pause before reacting. When someone pressures belonging, you ask yourself a simple question. Is this truth or influence? That moment of awareness gives you control. You stop reacting automatically. You start thinking deliberately. You regain ownership of your choices. Because manipulation does not disappear. But once you understand the system inside your own brain, you become harder to control. And now that you understand the psychological triggers manipulators rely on, it's time to examine the emotion they use most often. The emotion that overrides logic faster than almost anything else. The emotion that makes people comply even when they know something feels wrong. Guilt. And how it becomes the manipulator's most reliable weapon. Chapter 3. Guilt is the manipulator's favorite weapon. Of all the emotions a manipulator can use, guilt is the most powerful. Not anger, not fear, not intimidation. Guilt. Because guilt bypasses logic. It goes straight to obligation. When you feel guilty, your brain stops asking one important question. Is this fair? Instead, it asks a different question. How do I fix this? And that shift changes everything. Because the moment you start trying to fix guilt, you become easier to control. That's the key. Manipulators don't need to force your behavior. They just need to trigger your guilt. Your mind will do the rest. Think about how guilt appears in conversation. Rarely aggressive. Rarely direct. Usually quiet. Subtle. Almost polite. Someone says something like, "After everything I've done for you." Oh, I guess I just expected more from you. Oh, it's fine. I'll just handle it myself. Listen carefully to what's happening in these moments. They are not presenting facts. They are activating emotion. They are creating a psychological imbalance. Suddenly you feel like you owe something. Suddenly you feel like you've disappointed someone. Suddenly you feel responsible for fixing the situation, even if you did nothing wrong. That's how guilt manipulation works. It reframes the situation so that your independence feels like selfishness. And once that belief enters your mind, compliance becomes much easier. Because nobody wants to feel like the bad person. Guilt works because human beings are wired for responsibility. Healthy people care about how their actions affect others. They want to be fair. They want to be supportive. They want to contribute to relationships. That instinct is good. But manipulators exploit it. They turn your empathy into leverage. They use your sense of responsibility as a control mechanism. And they do it with simple language. A disappointed tone. A long pause. A sigh. Sometimes nothing more than silence. That silence can be powerful. Because your brain begins filling the space. Did I do something wrong? Should I help? Maybe I should change my decision. Notice what just happened. No argument. No debate. Just emotion. And emotion moved you closer to compliance. Here is something important you must understand. Guilt does not always mean you did something wrong. Let me repeat that. Guilt does not always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply a signal that someone else is uncomfortable with your boundaries. And boundaries often trigger manipulation, because boundaries remove control. When you say no, when you prioritize your time, when you refuse an unreasonable request, someone who benefits from your compliance may react emotionally. They may express disappointment. They may question your character. They may imply that you are selfish, not because you are wrong, but because your independence disrupts their expectations. And the easiest way to restore control is to make you feel guilty. This is why guilt manipulation is so common in close relationships, family, friendships, romantic partners. People who know you well understand your emotional triggers. They know what matters to you. They know the values you care about. And sometimes those values become tools. If you value loyalty, they question your loyalty. If you value kindness, they question your kindness. If you value responsibility, they question your responsibility. Suddenly the conversation is no longer about the situation. It becomes about your character. And when your character feels threatened, guilt intensifies. Because nobody wants to believe they are a bad person. Let's examine a simple real-world scenario. A coworker asks you to help with a project. You are already overwhelmed with your own work. You politely decline. And the response comes quickly. Wow, I thought you were more of a team player. That sentence is not information. It is pressure. It is designed to trigger guilt. It suggests that your reasonable boundary reflects something negative about your character. And your brain reacts immediately. Maybe I should help. Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe they're right. That internal shift is exactly what the manipulator wants. Because guilt moves you toward compliance. Not because the request is fair, but because the emotion feels uncomfortable. And your brain wants relief. Here is the critical lesson. Manipulation works when guilt goes unexamined. It fails when guilt is questioned. You have a choice. Instead of reacting instantly, pause. Ask yourself one simple question. Is this guilt based on truth or pressure? Sometimes the answer will be truth. Sometimes you did make a mistake. Sometimes responsibility is appropriate. But many times the guilt is artificial, manufactured, strategically triggered. And recognizing that difference protects your autonomy. Because guilt is often control wearing the mask of morality. Remember that phrase. Guilt is often control wearing the mask of morality. Not always, but often enough that you must examine it carefully. Another sign of guilt manipulation is repetition. Manipulators often repeat emotional reminders. They remind you of favors. They remind you of sacrifices. They remind you of past support. Not because those things are relevant, but because repetition strengthens obligation. They want the emotional weight to grow. The more you hear it, the more responsible you feel. And the more responsible you feel, the more likely you are to comply. That's the pattern. Emotional pressure. Growing obligation. Gradual surrender of your decision. But remember this. Gratitude does not require obedience. Kindness does not require submission. Support does not require surrendering your boundaries. You can appreciate someone without becoming controlled by them. You don't need their permission to protect your time, energy, or decisions. The moment you begin recognizing guilt manipulation, something changes. The emotional pressure weakens. You still feel the guilt, but now you observe it. You analyze it. You question it. Instead of immediately reacting, you pause. And that pause restores your power. Because manipulation thrives on immediate emotional reactions. But awareness creates distance. Distance creates clarity. Clarity creates freedom. So the next time someone tries to steer your decision through guilt, remember the rule. Pause. Observe. Examine the emotion. And repeat the principle. Guilt is often control, wearing the mask of morality. Once you understand that truth, guilt loses much of its ability to control you. But guilt is only one tactic. Manipulators rarely rely on just one method. Sometimes they don't use guilt at all. Sometimes they use something far more subtle. Pressure that is never spoken. Expectations that are never stated. Influence hidden between the lines of a conversation. And that brings us to the next tactic. One of the most invisible forms of manipulation. The power of subtle pressure. Chapter 4. The power of subtle pressure. Most manipulation does not sound like control. It sounds like suggestion. It sounds like expectation. It sounds like something that was never actually said. That is the power of subtle pressure. Manipulators rarely demand. They imply. They rarely tell you directly what to do. Instead, they create an emotional environment where the answer they want feels like the only comfortable option. That's the key. The pressure is never spoken, but you feel it. And once you feel it, your mind begins adjusting. Not because someone forced you, because your brain wants relief from the tension. Subtle pressure works because humans are extremely sensitive to social signals. Tone, facial expressions, silence, disappointment. Your brain reads these signals automatically, before you even process the words being spoken. This means influence can happen without direct instruction. Someone doesn't need to say you should do this. All they need to do is create an atmosphere where not doing it feels uncomfortable. And discomfort drives behavior. Imagine a simple scenario. You're in a conversation with a friend or coworker. You mention a decision you've made. Maybe you've decided to decline an invitation. Maybe you've decided not to help with something. And the response is quiet. A pause. Then a small sigh. Then a sentence like, "Oh, okay." No argument. No confrontation. Just subtle disappointment. But suddenly you feel something. A pressure in the room. An emotional weight. And without realizing it, your mind begins reconsidering your decision. Maybe I should just do it. Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe I should help. Notice what happened. No one forced you. No one demanded anything. But the environment shifted. And that shift influenced your behavior. That is subtle pressure. And it works because your brain is trying to restore emotional balance. Manipulators understand something very important. Direct control creates resistance. Subtle influence avoids it. If someone orders you to do something, you might push back. You might question it. You might defend your position. But if the pressure is quiet, if it's implied instead of spoken, your brain often adjusts without realizing it. That's why the most effective manipulators avoid direct demands. They shape the situation instead. They guide the emotional atmosphere. And slowly your decision moves in the direction they want. Subtle pressure often appears in the form of expectations, unspoken rules, invisible obligations, statements like, "Most people would help in this situation. Everyone else is doing it. I just thought you'd understand." These phrases don't command anything, but they create a social frame. They imply what the correct behavior should be. And once that frame exists, your brain begins comparing your behavior against it. Am I being unreasonable? Am I the only one refusing? Maybe I should reconsider. Again, influence happens without direct force. Because manipulation thrives in what is implied, not what is said. Remember that phrase. Manipulation thrives in what is implied, not what is said. Tone is another powerful tool. The same words spoken in different tones can create completely different pressure. A calm voice can suggest approval. A cold voice can signal disapproval. A sarcastic tone can imply judgment. And because humans are deeply sensitive to tone, your brain reacts instantly. You begin adjusting your behavior to restore emotional harmony, sometimes without even noticing. This is why subtle manipulation often feels confusing. Nothing obvious happened. No argument occurred. But somehow you still feel pushed. That confusion is part of the tactic. Because when influence is unclear, people rarely confront it. They simply adapt. Silence is another powerful form of subtle pressure. In fact, silence can be more powerful than words. When someone responds with silence after your decision, your brain starts filling the gap. Did I upset them? Are they angry? Maybe I should explain. And suddenly you begin negotiating with yourself, trying to repair a tension that was never directly expressed. Manipulators understand this psychological reaction. They allow the silence to work for them, because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty often leads to compliance. Another version of subtle pressure appears through disappointment. Not anger, not criticism, just disappointment. A slow headshake, a sigh, a quiet statement like, "I didn't expect that from you." This tactic works because disappointment feels personal. It implies that your choice reflects something negative about your character. And when people feel their character is being judged, they often change behavior quickly. Not to solve the situation, but to restore their identity, to prove they are still a good person. Manipulators know this, and they rely on it. Here is the dangerous part about subtle pressure. Most people don't recognize it. They assume their decisions are completely their own. But when you examine the situation carefully, you often discover invisible influence shaping the outcome. Small signals, small comments, small emotional cues, all working together to steer your behavior. And because the pressure is subtle, it rarely gets challenged, which is exactly why it is effective. But awareness breaks the pattern. Once you begin noticing subtle pressure, its power decreases. You start recognizing the tone shifts, the implied expectations, the silent disapproval, and instead of reacting automatically, you pause. You ask yourself a simple question. Is this a real request or an emotional signal designed to push me? That question creates space. Space between the pressure and your response. And inside that space, you regain control. You have a choice. You can respond deliberately instead of reacting automatically. You can maintain your decision without absorbing the emotional pressure. Because implied expectations do not equal obligations. Silence does not equal guilt. Disappointment does not equal wrongdoing. You don't need their permission to stand by your choices. The moment you begin recognizing subtle pressure, something powerful happens. You become harder to manipulate, not because manipulation disappears, but because the invisible signals become visible. And once influence becomes visible, it becomes easier to resist. Remember the principle. Manipulation thrives in what is implied, not what is said. The more aware you become of those implications, the stronger your independence becomes. But subtle pressure is not the only way manipulators gain influence. Sometimes they take the opposite approach. Instead of pressure, they use praise. Instead of criticism, they use admiration. Instead of tension, they offer validation. And that tactic is just as powerful, because praise lowers defenses faster than almost anything else. Which brings us to the next strategy, the sweetest form of control. Chapter 5. Flattery, the sweetest form of control. Not all manipulation feels uncomfortable. Some of it feels wonderful. Some of it feels like admiration, like respect, like appreciation. And that is exactly why it works. Because one of the most effective manipulation tools in the world is not pressure. It is praise, flattery, excessive admiration. Words designed to make you feel seen, valued, and important. At first, it feels harmless. It feels positive. It feels encouraging. But when praise is used strategically, it becomes influence. Because flattery lowers your defenses. And when defenses drop, control becomes easier. Remember this principle. Flattery opens the door to influence. Human beings crave validation. Everyone wants to feel respected. Everyone wants to feel capable. Everyone wants to feel admired. This desire is deeply wired into the human mind. Approval activates powerful reward systems in the brain. When someone compliments you, your brain releases dopamine. You feel good. You feel appreciated. You feel connected to the person giving the praise. And that emotional connection creates trust. But manipulators understand something important. Trust can be manufactured. All it takes is the right words delivered at the right moment. Imagine meeting someone new. Within minutes, they begin complimenting you. You're really intelligent. I can tell you're someone who works hard. Most people don't think the way you do. These statements feel good. They make you feel recognized. They make you feel respected. And because the praise feels genuine, your brain relaxes. You begin to trust the person. You begin to see them as someone who understands you. But sometimes the praise has a purpose. Because after the compliments come the requests. I could really use your help with something. I know someone like you would understand. You seem like the kind of person who would support this. Notice the pattern. Praise first. Request second. That sequence is not accidental. It is psychological strategy. Flattery works because it creates a subtle obligation. When someone praises you, you often feel pressure to live up to that praise. If someone calls you generous, you feel inclined to act generously. If someone calls you supportive, you feel inclined to support them. If someone calls you responsible, you feel inclined to behave responsibly. The compliment becomes a behavioral frame. And once that frame exists, your actions often follow it. That is the hidden influence of flattery. It shapes your identity in the moment. And then it encourages behavior that confirms that identity. Again, remember the rule. Flattery opens the door to influence. Manipulators often use a specific technique called identity praise. Instead of complimenting a single action, they compliment your character. They say things like, "You're one of the most reliable people I know. You're someone who always helps others. You're the type of person people can depend on." These statements are powerful because they define who you are. And once someone defines your identity, your brain begins protecting that identity. You want to prove the compliment is true. So when the request appears, saying no becomes harder. Because refusing might contradict the identity they just assigned to you. And people naturally resist contradicting their own identity. That is why identity-based flattery is such a powerful manipulation tactic. Another form of flattery appears through comparison. Manipulators may elevate you by lowering others. They might say things like, "You're much smarter than most people here. Other people don't understand this like you do. You're different from everyone else." These statements isolate you in a positive way. They make you feel unique, special, above average. And when someone makes you feel special, your trust in them grows quickly, because your brain associates them with positive emotion. But again, the praise often leads somewhere. Influence rarely ends with admiration. It usually moves toward compliance. Flattery is especially powerful when it appears during moments of insecurity. If someone compliments you about something you secretly doubt, the effect becomes even stronger. If you worry about your intelligence and someone praises your intelligence, you feel validated. If you worry about your value and someone praises your reliability, you feel reassured. And that reassurance builds emotional connection. The manipulator becomes the source of the validation, which means their influence grows. Because once someone controls the source of validation, they can shape behavior more easily. Now, this does not mean all compliments are manipulation. Not at all. Genuine appreciation exists. Real admiration exists. Healthy relationships include praise. The difference is intention. Genuine compliments do not create pressure. They do not come with hidden expectations. They do not lead immediately to requests. Manipulative flattery often follows a predictable sequence. Compliment. connection, request, influence. That pattern appears again and again. And once you see it, it becomes much easier to recognize. Here is the discipline you must develop. Enjoy praise, but analyze it. Accept compliments, but stay aware. When someone praises you excessively, ask yourself a simple question. Is this appreciation or preparation? Is this genuine or strategic? That question keeps your awareness active, because flattery is most powerful when it goes unquestioned. But awareness breaks the spell. You can appreciate the compliment without surrendering your judgment. You can accept praise without feeling obligated to comply. You have a choice. That's the key. Another important rule to remember. People who constantly flatter you may not respect you. They may simply want something from you. Real respect does not require constant praise. Real respect allows honesty. Real respect allows disagreement. Manipulative praise often avoids honesty, because honesty might weaken influence. So instead, the manipulator maintains admiration until the moment influence is needed. The more aware you become of flattery, the less control it has over you. You begin recognizing exaggerated compliments. You begin noticing the timing of praise before requests. You begin seeing the identity frames being placed around you. And once you see those patterns, your independence grows stronger. Because compliments no longer guide your decisions. Your principles do. Remember the rule one more time. Flattery opens the door to influence, but awareness closes that door. And once that door is closed, manipulation must rely on stronger tactics, more aggressive strategies. Sometimes strategies that go beyond influence. Sometimes strategies that attempt to control something much deeper, your perception of reality itself. Which leads us to one of the most dangerous manipulation techniques of all. A method that does not just influence your decisions. It changes how you see the world. Chapter 6. Gaslighting. Controlling reality itself. Most manipulation influences your decisions. Gaslighting goes further. It influences your reality. Because gaslighting is not about winning an argument. It is about controlling perception. Slowly, quietly, repeatedly, until the victim begins questioning their own memory, their own judgment, and eventually their own sanity. That's why gaslighting is one of the most dangerous forms of psychological manipulation. It doesn't just pressure you. It destabilizes you. And once someone destabilizes your perception of reality, influence becomes effortless. Remember the core principle. If someone controls your perception, they control your decisions. Gaslighting rarely begins dramatically. It begins small. A simple disagreement about what happened. You remember something clearly. The other person responds calmly. That never happened. Oh, you're remembering it wrong. At first, this may feel like a normal misunderstanding. People misremember things sometimes. But gaslighting is not about occasional disagreement. It is about repeated denial. The same pattern appearing again and again. You recall a conversation. They deny it. You point out something they said. They dismiss it. You explain how something made you feel. They minimize it. Over time, the repetition begins to affect you. You start wondering, did I misunderstand? Maybe I exaggerated. Maybe I'm remembering incorrectly. And that doubt is exactly what the manipulator wants. Gaslighting works because human memory is not perfect. Your brain reconstructs memories instead of replaying them like recordings. Which means confidence in your memory can weaken if someone challenges it repeatedly. Manipulators exploit this. They contradict your memories calmly, confidently, consistently, not with aggression, with certainty. And when someone denies your reality with absolute confidence, your brain starts questioning itself. Especially if the manipulator is someone you trust, a partner, a friend, a family member, someone close. Because trust amplifies influence. Another common gaslighting tactic is emotional invalidation. Instead of denying events, the manipulator denies your emotional reaction. You say something upset you. They respond, "You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Notice what happens here. The focus shifts. The issue is no longer what happened. The issue becomes your reaction. Suddenly you're not discussing the problem anymore. You're defending your emotions. And when this happens repeatedly, something dangerous occurs. You start doubting your emotional instincts. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe the problem is me. And once someone doubts their emotional instincts, their confidence weakens. That's the goal. Because confidence protects independence. But self-doubt invites control. Gaslighting also often includes reframing reality. The manipulator rewrites events in ways that make them appear innocent and you appear unreasonable. For example, you confront someone about a hurtful comment. Instead of addressing the comment, they respond with something like, "I was joking. You completely misunderstood. You're twisting my words." Now the conversation shifts again. Instead of discussing their behavior, you're defending your interpretation. The manipulator moves from being accountable to becoming the victim of your misunderstanding. And the more this pattern repeats, the more your perception becomes unstable. You begin second-guessing everything. Your memory, your interpretation, your emotional responses. And again, remember the principle. If someone controls your perception, they control your decisions. Another powerful gaslighting tactic is contradicting obvious facts. This happens when the manipulator denies things that clearly occurred. You might bring up a specific event, a conversation, a decision, and the response comes immediately. "I never said that. You're imagining things. That's not what happened." If this occurs occasionally, it might be misunderstanding. But when it happens consistently, it becomes psychological destabilization. Because when someone repeatedly denies reality, your brain faces two conflicting possibilities. Either they are lying, or you are mistaken. And if the manipulator is confident enough, persistent enough, and emotionally convincing enough, many people begin assuming the second option. They begin distrusting their own perception. That is the moment control deepens. Gaslighting also isolates the victim. Not always physically, but psychologically. The manipulator may suggest that other people also believe you are wrong. They might say, "Everyone thinks you're overreacting. Other people don't see it the way you do. You're the only one who has a problem with this." These statements create social doubt. You begin questioning whether your perspective is abnormal. And because humans fear isolation, the pressure increases. You start adjusting your beliefs to restore social harmony. But in reality, the information may be completely false. The manipulator may simply be inventing social agreement to strengthen their control. The long-term effect of gaslighting is erosion. Slow erosion of self-trust. Slow erosion of confidence. Slow erosion of independence. At first, the victim questions small details. Later, they question major decisions. Eventually, they rely on the manipulator to define reality. And once that dependency forms, influence becomes extremely powerful. Because the victim no longer trusts their own judgment. They trust the manipulator instead. And again, that leads back to the central rule. If someone controls your perception, they control your decisions. But awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize gaslighting, the pattern begins to break. Because gaslighting depends on confusion. Once you identify the tactic, confusion weakens. Clarity returns. Instead of immediately questioning yourself, you begin observing the behavior. You notice the repeated denial, the emotional invalidation, the constant reframing of reality. And instead of accepting the manipulator's narrative, you pause. You evaluate the facts. You trust your observations. You trust your experiences. You trust your memory unless there is clear evidence to challenge it. That shift restores something powerful: self-trust. And self-trust is one of the strongest defenses against manipulation. You have a choice. You can question your perception blindly, or you can examine the manipulation carefully. One leads to confusion. The other leads to clarity. The more confident you become in your perception, the harder gaslighting becomes. Manipulators rely on uncertainty. They rely on hesitation. They rely on your willingness to doubt yourself quickly. But when your confidence grows, their strategy weakens. Because the foundation of gaslighting is no longer stable. And once that foundation cracks, their influence begins to collapse. Remember the principle one more time. If someone controls your perception, they control your decisions. But when you reclaim control of your perception, you reclaim control of your life. However, manipulators rarely rely on only one tactic. If gaslighting weakens your perception, another strategy often appears next. A strategy designed to keep you emotionally unstable, confused, unsure, constantly trying to regain approval. And that tactic is emotional inconsistency, a pattern of unpredictable behavior that keeps people psychologically off balance. Which brings us to the next manipulation strategy. Chapter 7. The Strategy of Emotional Confusion. Control does not always come from pressure. Sometimes it comes from instability, from unpredictability, from emotional confusion. Because when people feel emotionally stable, they think clearly. But when people feel emotionally unstable, they start chasing certainty. And manipulators understand this very well. So instead of being consistently kind or consistently hostile, they alternate kindness, then criticism, support, then rejection, warmth, then distance. This emotional unpredictability creates confusion, and confusion weakens independence. Remember the principle. Confusion creates control. Human beings naturally seek emotional balance. When relationships feel stable, your mind relaxes. You know where you stand. You understand the boundaries. You trust the environment. But when emotional signals constantly change, your brain enters a different state. A state of vigilance. A state of uncertainty. You begin asking questions. Did I do something wrong? Why are they acting different today? How do I get things back to normal? And that shift is critical. Because once you start trying to restore emotional stability, your behavior begins adjusting. You try harder. You become more careful, more accommodating, more compliant. Not because someone demanded it, but because you want the tension to dissipate. One common form of emotional confusion is intermittent approval. The manipulator gives praise one moment and criticism the next. One day they admire you. The next day they question you. One moment they support you. The next moment they withdraw. This unpredictable pattern creates emotional dependency. Because the brain becomes focused on owning the positive moments again. You begin chasing the approval, trying to recreate the warmth you experienced earlier. And this is where manipulation becomes powerful. Because the manipulator controls the emotional reward. They decide when approval appears. And when approval becomes unpredictable, its psychological impact grows stronger. This phenomenon is deeply connected to how the brain processes rewards. Predictable rewards create stability, but unpredictable rewards create obsession. Think about gambling. People become addicted not because they win constantly, but because they win occasionally. The unpredictability keeps them engaged, waiting, trying again, hoping the next attempt will bring the reward. The same psychological pattern can appear in manipulative relationships. Kindness becomes the reward. Criticism becomes the loss. And the person experiencing this cycle begins trying harder to regain the kindness. That effort creates compliance. without the manipulator ever demanding it directly. Again, the rule applies. Confusion creates control. Another tactic within emotional confusion is mixed signals. The manipulator says supportive things but behaves differently. They say they care, but they act distant. They promise loyalty, but they withdraw when needed. These contradictions create psychological tension. Because your brain tries to resolve inconsistencies, you start searching for explanations. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe they are just stressed. Maybe I need to try harder. Notice the pattern. The focus shifts away from their behavior and toward your effort. You begin adjusting yourself to stabilize the relationship, which increases their influence. Manipulators may also use emotional withdrawal. After a disagreement or boundary, they suddenly become cold, quiet, distant, not openly hostile, just emotionally unavailable. This withdrawal triggers anxiety, because human beings interpret emotional distance as a threat to connection. And once that anxiety appears, your brain moves into repair mode. You begin trying to restore warmth. You apologize. You compromise. You soften your position, even if you were originally correct. Because emotional stability feels more important than winning the disagreement. That emotional shift is exactly what the manipulator wants. Another sign of emotional confusion is unpredictable reactions. The same action may produce different responses on different days. Sometimes they react calmly. Sometimes they react with criticism. Sometimes they ignore the issue completely. This unpredictability makes it difficult to establish clear expectations. You no longer know what will trigger approval or disapproval. And when rules are unclear, people become cautious. They adjust their behavior constantly to avoid negative reactions. This constant adjustment gradually shifts control away from you and toward the person creating the instability. But here is something important to understand. Emotional confusion is not always intentional. Some people behave inconsistently because they lack emotional regulation, because they struggle with their own feelings. But intentional or not, the effect can still create manipulation. The result is the same: uncertainty, instability, psychological pressure to adapt. And once you begin adapting constantly to someone else's emotional shifts, your independence begins shrinking. Your decisions become influenced by their reactions, not by your own principles. So how do you break this pattern? Awareness, consistency, and boundaries. First, recognize the cycle. Notice when kindness and criticism alternate unpredictably. Notice when approval appears only after compliance. Notice when emotional warmth disappears after disagreement. These patterns reveal emotional manipulation. Second, stop chasing emotional stability from someone else. You cannot control another person's behavior, but you can control your response. Do not change your values just to restore someone's approval. Do not sacrifice your boundaries just to avoid emotional tension. You have a choice. That's the key. Healthy relationships create clarity, respect, consistency. You know where you stand. You understand the expectations. Manipulative dynamics create the opposite: uncertainty, instability, confusion. And confusion creates control. Remember that phrase. Confusion creates control. The more emotionally stable you remain, the less effective this tactic becomes. Because manipulators rely on emotional reactions. But emotional discipline removes their leverage. You stop chasing approval. You stop adjusting constantly. You stop playing the psychological game. And once that happens, their influence weakens. But emotional confusion is not the only silent manipulation tool. Sometimes manipulators remove something even more powerful than approval. They remove attention itself. They disappear emotionally. They stop communicating. They create distance and silence. And silence, when used strategically, can become one of the most powerful manipulation tactics of all. Which brings us to the next chapter. Chapter 8. Silence is also a manipulation tool. Not all manipulation is loud. Some of it is quiet. Some of it says nothing at all. And yet, it still controls behavior. Because silence, when used intentionally, can become a powerful form of psychological pressure. Words can influence you, but absence can influence you even more. Remember the principle. Absence can be a weapon. Human beings are deeply sensitive to social connection, attention, communication, recognition. These signals tell your brain that you are accepted, valued, and included. But when those signals suddenly disappear, something changes inside you. Your brain begins searching for an explanation. Did I do something wrong? Why are they ignoring me? Did I upset them? This uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety triggers a powerful instinct. Repair the connection, restore the relationship, remove the tension. And manipulators understand this reaction very well. The silent treatment is one of the most common forms of this tactic. Instead of discussing a disagreement, instead of expressing their frustration, the manipulator simply withdraws. They stop responding. They stop engaging. They stop acknowledging your presence. Conversations become short, cold, empty. Sometimes they avoid eye contact. Sometimes they refuse to respond entirely. And this silence sends a message without saying a word. The message is simple. Something is wrong. But the reason is never clearly explained, which leaves you searching for answers. Silence creates psychological pressure because humans hate uncertainty. Your brain wants resolution, clarity, closure. But silence removes those things. It leaves the situation unfinished. And when situations feel unfinished, your mind keeps returning to them. You replay conversations. You analyze your behavior. You question your decisions. All while the manipulator remains silent. That silence creates emotional imbalance. And most people respond by trying to fix it. Imagine this situation. You disagree with someone about something important. You explain your position calmly. Instead of discussing it further, the other person becomes distant. They stop texting. They stop responding. They become emotionally unavailable. Hours pass. Maybe days. And suddenly the silence becomes uncomfortable. You start thinking, maybe I should apologize. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I should just give in. Notice what happened. The disagreement is no longer about the original issue. The focus has shifted. Now the focus is restoring communication, restoring emotional connection. And if compliance brings back that connection, the manipulator has succeeded. Because silence moved your behavior. The silent treatment activates something powerful in the human brain. Fear of rejection. Social rejection historically meant danger. Isolation from the group could threaten survival. Because of that evolutionary history, your brain reacts strongly to social exclusion, even temporary exclusion. Being ignored activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain, which means silence does not feel neutral. It feels painful. And when people experience social pain, they naturally try to eliminate it by restoring connection, even if that means compromising their own position. That is why silence can be such an effective manipulation tactic. Again, remember the rule. Absence can be a weapon. Another form of silence manipulation appears through withheld approval. The manipulator does not ignore you completely, but they remove something you value. Praise, recognition, encouragement, support. Maybe they once expressed appreciation regularly, but now it disappears. Suddenly your efforts receive no response. Your achievements receive no acknowledgement. Your contributions feel invisible. And over time, this absence creates psychological tension. You begin trying harder, working harder, seeking the approval that used to come naturally. And when approval finally returns, it feels powerful, relieving, rewarding, which increases the manipulator's influence, because they now control the emotional reward. Silence can also be used strategically in conversations. A manipulator may ask a question. You answer honestly. Then they say nothing. They simply stay, or pause, or respond with a long silence. That silence creates pressure, because humans feel uncomfortable with conversational gaps. Your brain wants to fill the space, so you begin talking more, explaining more, sometimes even changing your answer, just to relieve the discomfort. Once again, influence occurs without direct force. The silence itself becomes the pressure. Here is the important distinction. Silence is not always manipulation. Sometimes people need space. Sometimes they need time to process emotions. Healthy communication can include temporary distance. But manipulation uses silence strategically, not for reflection, for control. The key difference is intention. Healthy space eventually leads to conversation. Manipulative silence avoids resolution. It maintains tension until compliance appears. So how do you respond when silence becomes a weapon? First, recognize the pattern. Notice when communication disappears after disagreement. Notice when approval is withheld after boundaries. Notice when silence appears consistently after you assert independence. These signals reveal emotional manipulation. Second, resist the instinct to chase resolution immediately. Your brain will urge you to restore connection quickly, but rushing to repair the silence often strengthens the manipulation. Instead, remain calm. Remain patient. Allow the silence to exist without immediately adjusting your position. You have a choice. You do not need their permission to maintain your boundaries. When you refuse to chase silence, something important happens. The manipulator loses leverage. Because the tactic depends on your discomfort. It depends on your need to repair the connection. But when you remain emotionally steady, the pressure weakens. You stop reacting automatically. You stop negotiating with silence. You allow communication to resume naturally, or not at all. And either way, your independence remains intact. Remember the principle one more time. Absence can be a weapon, but only if you allow that absence to control your decisions. When your emotional stability remains strong, silence loses its influence. And once silence no longer works, manipulators often look for a different path, a different strategy. They search for individuals who are easier to influence, people whose empathy, kindness, or desire for approval makes them more vulnerable. Because manipulation is rarely random. Manipulators often study their targets carefully. They observe personality traits. They test boundaries. They identify who is most likely to comply. Which leads us to the next critical question. Why do some people become targets more often than others? Chapter 9. How manipulators identify their targets. Manipulation is rarely random. Manipulators do not move blindly through the world hoping someone will comply. They observe. They test. They study behavior. Because influence becomes much easier when the right target is chosen. That's the uncomfortable truth. Manipulators look for specific traits, certain patterns of behavior, certain emotional tendencies, not weakness, but vulnerability. And often, the very qualities that make someone a good person can also make them easier to manipulate. Kindness, empathy, patience, the desire to help. These qualities are valuable in healthy relationships. But in the presence of manipulation, they can become entry points for control. Remember the core principle. The more approval you need, the easier you are to control. Manipulators often begin by observing how people respond to small situations. They test boundaries quietly. A small favor, a minor request, a subtle inconvenience. And then they watch the reaction. Does the person hesitate to say no? Do they apologize even when they did nothing wrong? Do they prioritize others even when it costs them something? These small reactions reveal larger patterns. Because people who struggle to set boundaries often reveal themselves quickly, not through dramatic events, through everyday interactions. And manipulators notice these signals. One of the most common traits manipulators seek is high empathy. Empathetic people care deeply about how others feel. They listen carefully. They try to understand different perspectives. They want to reduce conflict. They want to help others when possible. These qualities create strong relationships in healthy environments. But manipulators can exploit empathy, because empathetic people often give the benefit of the doubt. They assume good intentions. They try to understand harmful behavior instead of confronting it immediately. They may say things like, "Maybe they didn't mean it that way. They are probably just having a bad day. I should try to be patient." While empathy is valuable, unchecked empathy can delay recognition of manipulation. And that delay gives manipulators more time to establish influence. Another trait manipulators often target is conflict avoidance. Some people feel extremely uncomfortable with confrontation. They dislike tension. They dislike arguments. They dislike disappointing others. So when conflict appears, they look for the fastest path back to harmony, even if that path requires compromise or compliance. Manipulators recognize this instinct quickly. They may introduce small tensions intentionally, not to resolve them, but to observe how the other person reacts. If the person immediately tries to restore peace, the manipulator learns something important. They learn that emotional discomfort can drive behavior. And once that pattern becomes clear, influence becomes easier. Because the manipulator knows that tension will push the person toward agreement. Another vulnerability is excessive responsibility. Some people feel responsible for everything. Other people's emotions, other people's problems, other people's happiness. They believe that if someone around them feels upset, they must have done something wrong. And that belief creates pressure. Because manipulators can trigger that sense of responsibility easily. A disappointed tone, a frustrated comment, a subtle expression of frustration, and suddenly the responsible person begins trying to fix the situation, not because they caused the problem, but because they feel obligated to repair the emotional atmosphere. This instinct makes manipulation easier, because emotional pressure leads to immediate action. But perhaps the most powerful vulnerability is the need for approval. Humans naturally appreciate recognition. There is nothing wrong with wanting appreciation. But when approval becomes a necessity rather than a preference, influence grows stronger. People who rely heavily on approval often adjust their behavior to maintain it. They monitor reactions constantly. They analyze other people's opinions. They shape their decisions around acceptance. And manipulators understand this pattern immediately. Because approval can become leverage. Praise can encourage compliance. Disapproval can create pressure. Acceptance can be given or withdrawn strategically. And when approval becomes the reward, control becomes easier. Remember the phrase, the more approval you need, the easier you are to control. Manipulators may also observe how people react to guilt. Do they apologize quickly? Do they accept blame easily? Do they try to repair situations immediately? If someone absorbs guilt quickly, they become easier to influence. Because guilt motivates action. The manipulator learns that emotional pressure can move this person's behavior quickly. And once that lesson is learned, it can be used repeatedly. Another sign manipulators watch for is lack of boundaries. People with clear boundaries say things like, "I'm not comfortable with that. I can't do that right now. That doesn't work for me." These responses create limits. Limits reduce manipulation. But people without strong boundaries often hesitate. They soften their responses. They say things like, "Maybe. I'll try. Let me think about it. These answers signal uncertainty, and uncertainty invites pressure. Because if someone is unsure, influence can push them toward compliance. Here is the important truth. None of these traits are flaws. Empathy is not weakness. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not weakness. The problem is not the trait. The problem is the absence of boundaries protecting that trait. Kindness without boundaries invites exploitation. Empathy without awareness invites manipulation. Responsibility without limits invites control. But when kindness is combined with discipline, when empathy is balanced with awareness, when responsibility includes boundaries, those traits become strengths instead of vulnerabilities. You have a choice. You can remain kind without becoming compliant. You can remain empathetic without becoming controllable. The moment you understand how manipulators identify targets, your awareness increases dramatically. You begin noticing when someone tests your boundaries. You begin recognizing when emotional pressure appears early in a relationship. You begin identifying patterns of influence before they become deeply established. And that awareness changes your responses. Instead of automatically accommodating, you pause. Instead of immediately agreeing, you evaluate. Instead of seeking approval, you prioritize clarity. That shift protects your independence. Because manipulators rely on unconscious reactions. But awareness disrupts those reactions. Remember the principle one more time. The more approval you need, the easier you are to control. But when approval becomes optional instead of necessary, influence weakens. You stop adjusting your behavior to maintain acceptance. You stop chasing validation. You start making decisions based on your principles. And once that transformation happens, something powerful occurs. Manipulation becomes easier to recognize, easier to resist, easier to neutralize. Which leads us to the final and most important lesson of this entire audiobook. Because once you see manipulation clearly, you gain the most powerful defense of all, awareness. And awareness changes everything. Chapter 10. Awareness is the end of manipulation. Every manipulation tactic you've learned in this audiobook shares one common weakness. It only works when it goes unnoticed. Manipulation survives in the dark. It survives inside emotional reactions, unexamined pressure, and automatic responses. But the moment you see it clearly, its power begins to dissipate. That is the final and most important lesson. Awareness is the end of manipulation. Not because manipulators disappear, but because their tactics stop working on you. Remember the principle. Awareness removes control. Think about every strategy we've explored. Guilt, subtle pressure, flattery, gaslighting, emotional confusion, silence. Every one of these tactics relies on the same mechanism. Your automatic reaction. The manipulator triggers emotion. And before you have time to analyze the situation, your brain moves toward compliance. You apologize. You explain. You compromise. You surrender your decision. But awareness interrupts that process. It slows everything down. Instead of reacting instantly, you observe. And observation changes everything. When you recognize manipulation, your internal dialogue changes. Instead of asking, "How do I fix this?" you ask, "What is happening here?" Instead of reacting emotionally, you analyze the behavior. You notice the patterns. You identify the tactics. And suddenly the pressure loses its mystery. Because manipulation depends on confusion. Clarity breaks that confusion. And when confusion disappears, control weakens. That's why awareness removes control. But awareness alone is not enough. You must pair awareness with discipline. Because recognizing manipulation is only the first step. Responding deliberately is the second. And discipline is what protects your independence. There are 3 practical habits that strengthen this discipline. Simple habits, but powerful ones. The first habit is pause before responding. Manipulation thrives on immediate reactions. The manipulator creates emotional pressure, so you will respond quickly, before you think, before you analyze. But the pause changes the dynamic. Even a few seconds of silence can break the momentum of manipulation. Instead of answering immediately, you allow space. Space for your thinking to catch up with your emotions. You have a choice. You always have a choice. The second habit is question emotional pressure. Whenever you feel sudden guilt, urgency, or pressure, stop and ask yourself a simple question. Is this a real problem or emotional influence? Sometimes the pressure will be legitimate. Sometimes someone truly needs help. Sometimes you did make a mistake. But many times the pressure is strategic, designed to move your behavior quickly. The moment you question that pressure, you weaken its power. Because emotional manipulation depends on unquestioned emotion. But questioning emotion restores rational thinking. The third habit is require clarity. Manipulation often hides in vague language, implied expectations, unspoken assumptions. But clarity forces manipulation into the open. When someone applies subtle pressure, you can ask calm, direct questions. What exactly are you asking me to do? Why do you think that's my responsibility? Can you explain what you mean by that? These questions remove ambiguity. And when ambiguity disappears, manipulation becomes harder to sustain. Because manipulators rely on implication. But clarity exposes implication. Another powerful defense is emotional stability. Manipulation feeds on emotional reactions. If guilt overwhelms you, influence grows stronger. If confusion overwhelms you, control increases. If approval becomes necessary, independence weakens. But emotional stability changes the entire dynamic. When your reactions remain calm and measured, manipulators lose their leverage. Their tactics no longer trigger immediate responses. Their strategies lose momentum. And once momentum disappears, influence becomes difficult. This does not mean you must become cold or distant. Awareness is not cynicism. It is clarity. You can still be kind. You can still be empathetic. You can still care about others deeply. But awareness allows you to protect those qualities. Because kindness with awareness becomes strength. Empathy with boundaries becomes power. And responsibility with discipline becomes independence. You do not need to abandon your humanity to resist manipulation. You simply need to combine it with awareness. Here is another important truth. Not everyone who uses manipulation does so intentionally. Some people learned these behaviors growing up. Some people repeat patterns they experienced in their own relationships. Some people manipulate without realizing it. But intention does not change the effect. Manipulation still creates pressure, still distorts decisions, still reduces independence, which is why awareness remains essential. Because awareness allows you to respond deliberately instead of automatically. As your awareness grows, something powerful happens. Your perspective changes. You begin noticing patterns quickly. The subtle guilt, the strategic praise, the sudden silence, the emotional confusion. These tactics become visible. And once they are visible, they lose their mystery. They lose their influence. Because awareness removes control. Remember that phrase. Awareness removes control. You will still encounter manipulation in the world. In workplaces, in friendships, in families, in relationships. Influence is part of human interaction. But when your awareness remains active, your independence remains protected. You stop reacting automatically. You stop surrendering decisions to emotional pressure. You start responding deliberately. And deliberate decisions create personal power. The ultimate goal is not to eliminate influence from your life. That would be impossible. The goal is to ensure that your decisions remain your own. Not driven by guilt. Not shaped by pressure. Not manipulated by emotional confusion, but guided by clarity, guided by principles, guided by conscious choice. You have a choice. That's the key. And the moment you recognize that choice, manipulation begins to lose its grip. So carry this principle with you. In every conversation, in every relationship, in every decision, observe the patterns, question the pressure, pause before reacting, require clarity, and remember the rule that ends manipulation before it begins. Awareness removes control. Once you see the game clearly, you stop playing it on someone else's terms. And that is the moment your decisions truly become your own. Manipulation only works in the dark. It works when pressure feels normal. It works when guilt feels like responsibility. It works when confusion replaces clarity. But once you understand the patterns, the tactics, and the psychology behind influence, the game changes. You begin to notice the subtle phrases, the emotional traps, the hidden expectations buried inside polite conversations. And when you see manipulation clearly, you gain something most people never develop: psychological independence. You stop reacting automatically. You stop complying out of guilt. You stop surrendering your decisions to invisible pressure. Instead, you pause. You observe. You choose deliberately. And that is the moment control returns to you. So from this point forward, remember one principle: question pressure. Notice guilt. Watch patterns. Because the more aware you become, the harder you are to control.